So let me just move quickly now to talk a little bit about the Trump administration and the Biden administration and how they've responded to these changes in Chinese policy. So, the U.S. response under the Obama administration, I talked about the pivot and the rebalance. They also gradually, over 2015, 2016, sort of toward the end point, as China was rolling out things like the Belt and Road Initiative, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Jackie talked about the challenges on the cyber front. There was actually a cyber agreement that was signed between China and the United States in 2015. Jackie's exactly right. For a little bit of time, it seemed as though China was, sort of slowing down, at the very least, a lot of its state-directed cyber economic espionage attacks, although more recently people have been saying they just got better at it. So that it actually never changed. They were just much more sophisticated. But there was a moment at which, things seemed to be improving. The Obama administration was still of a mind that, despite the fact that they recognized that China was changing under Xi Jinping, was presenting a greater threat to the United States, that engagement still mattered. That we still wanted to find, and it was still important to find, areas of cooperation with China. You couldn't do much on climate change if you weren't working with China. You wanted to work with China on global public health. You wanted to work with them on cybersecurity. So engagement still was still there, but I would say it moved from engage but hedge to hedge but engage, right? So a slight shift, a harder edge. The Trump administration, of course, introduced an entirely different approach, and I think it moved from engage but hedge to hedge but engage to what I would call compete, counter, and contain. It adopted the view that China was not only a strategic competitor, but a revisionist power, so one that was bent on undermining the current order. I think the important thing to understand about the Trump policy is that it was really two distinct policies. And there's the President Trump policy, which was a bigger policy in the sense that it actually represented a shift in how he viewed the U.S. role on the global stage, and that then shaped U.S. policy toward China. So, for example, President Trump believed that there was little value in the U.S. upholding the liberal international order, right? So he, pulled the United States, or started the process of pulling the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord, out of the World Health Organization, out of the UN Human Rights Commission, out of the Iran nuclear deal, right? So when you're pulling your country out of all of these international, arrangements, you're obviously not going to be interested in integrating China into them, right? Because you yourself, don't believe in them. So one of the fundamental pillars of the engagement policy, integrating China in the international system, no longer held any water. President Trump also devalued U.S. allies. He believed that the United States had borne an unfair share of the burden of global security. And he treated allies really no differently than he treated countries such as China and Russia. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, he often seemed to admire leaders like Xi Jinping and Putin and to a lesser extent maybe Kim Jong-un. But he used to talk about Xi Jinping as his best friend. But as I often point out, you never heard Xi Jinping talk about Trump as his best friend. Well, what Xi Jinping said was his best friend, literally in a talk he gave, was Putin. So anyway, so President Trump brought a different overall worldview in terms of how the U.S. position on the global stage. In terms of the priorities with China, they were two. First, trade, right, redressing the bilateral trade deficit, and second, getting China's cooperation on North Korea. I think COVID clearly signaled the end of Trump's love affair with Xi Jinping. He said, I used to like him, but I don't feel the same way anymore. Basically where we ended up with the Trump administration was a space where, we're in the midst of a trade war. We had no bilateral strategic dialogue. We started off with one in the Trump administration. They constructed their own strategic dialogue, but by the end of it, there were no meetings going on between the United States and China. A process of decoupling, technological decoupling was underway. But the president's approach doesn't really define the Trump administration approach. And there were, if you look underneath the president, at Secretary of State, Defense, Secretary Mattis, H.R. McMaster. Basically, we've got most of the Trump National Security Council housed now here at Hoover, I have to say, between Matt Pottinger and Matt Turpin, Nadia Shadlow, in one form or another, and H.R. McMaster. they pursued a policy that was much more like an Obama-era policy, much more like a traditional internationalist and multilateral foreign policy. It represented, a commitment to traditional U.S. values. Free and open Indo-Pacific was about, freedom of navigation, free and fair trade, good governance, working with allies in the Quad, Japan, Australia, and India, right? Thinking through joint projects on infrastructure. So this was a very different vision. You didn't actually hear President Trump talking very often about things like the free and open Indo-Pacific or about the Quad. But all these things were taking place. He obviously signed off on them. All these things were taking place during his administration. You had enhanced status for Taiwan. This administration, Trump administration, worked very hard to support Taiwan through a number of different acts that were passed by Congress, through normalizing military sales, trying to integrate Taiwan into regional agreements. Trump administration was very strong on human rights. Get very little credit for that, but actually, they sanctioned companies that were involved in surveillance in Xinjiang. They went after Chinese officials who were involved in repression in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. You had the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act that was passed by Congress and signed by the president. So there was a lot going on, in this space that I think would surprise many people if they, just thought, about the Trump administration. They might not realize how much was happening. There was a lot of effort, again, at that second level down, to push back against China as it tried to spread its influence through the Belt and Road and even in the United Nations. So, you can look. So despite the fact that President Trump, for the most part, disdained the UN, people there worked very hard, for example, to prevent the Chinese candidate from taking the leadership position within the World Intellectual Property Organization. So they worked with allies and others to ensure that that didn't happen. When China tried to push the Belt and Road Initiative to be part of the reauthorization bill for the UN mission to Afghanistan, the U.S. pushed back against that and managed to succeed, and China, threatened to veto it twice, but the U.S. Succeeded. So I put that out there because I think there's a sort of a one view of how the U.S. approached China during the Trump administration that was so radically different from the way that previous administrations had dealt with China. And indeed, it was at one level, but in another level, it represented an enormous amount of continuity with traditional U.S. foreign policy. So let me just finish now by talking about the third inflection point, moving from the Trump to the Biden administration. And I think it's fair to say that the early failings of the U.S. response to COVID-19 and the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol allowed China to paint democracy and the United States, as failing, right? The U.S. Painted as a highly polarized society and a declining power. Nonetheless, China has failed to capitalize on that sort of vacuum in leadership that the U.S. presented, and on all of the U.S.'s problems because of its own failings, right? Because of its very unattractive and aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy, because of its actions in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, because of the fact that it sanctioned EU officials for the EU sanctions on China for Xinjiang, caused an investment deal, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, was 7 years in the making between the European Union and China. It basically collapsed because of this back in last December. So China, despite the fact that the United States certainly is facing an enormous number of problems, China is not able really to take advantage of this to sort of push itself as a potential replacement, for the United States. In terms of how the Biden administration is dealing with China, I think so. Okay, truth in advertising. So I'm going to join the Biden administration in a couple of weeks. So let me just put that out there now, but I'm perfectly able to be critical of what's happening and whatever, but just let me put that out there because, if you see it, then you'll be like, hey, didn't we just hear her, blah, blah. So, okay, so in any case, I think if you look at the Biden administration, I think what has struck people most is just the degree of continuity in many respects with the Trump administration policy. So on issues like Xinjiang, on Taiwan, On the trade and technology fronts, we've seen virtually no shift from the way that the Biden administration has approached China from the way that the Trump administration approached China. Where we do see significant difference, I would say, is in the foundations of the Biden approach. So, starting with, in order to manage the relationship with China, it begins at home, right? We have to strengthen ourselves at home, and that means, investing in infrastructure, investing in technology, leading on things like global climate change and renewable energy. Certainly, President Biden, different from President Trump, has made it very clear that he is a strong proponent of the liberal international order. He wants to hold a democracy summit. There is not only a willingness to stand up and say allies matter in our approach to China, but to say allies are essential. In fact, the United States can't manage its relationship with China without working with its allies. And so it's not only the Quad, which has received a significant boost under President Biden, the sort of that big vaccine initiative that came out early on, but also encouraging the Europeans to become more deeply engaged in the Asia-Pacific, not just in the economic areas where they've always had some interest, but also in security area. And so you had, for example, the UK, I want to say France, Germany, and Japan, all doing a military exercise in the Bay of Bengal, India, with the Quad. So a mix of European partners and the Quad undertaking military exercise in the Asia Pacific. So I think it's a shift in how the United States is orienting its approach to China. In some ways, it's reminiscent of the Obama policy, and that makes sense because basically 90% of the people leading China policy right now are from the Obama administration. But it is an understanding that yes, the China relationship matters, and it matters a lot. But the most important thing that we can do is to get our relationship with our allies and partners right, and everything will flow out of that. There is also, clearly a difference in opinion in terms of multilateral institutions. The Obama administration is not just about pushing back against China. It has actively rejoined many of the agreements and arrangements that the Trump administration was pulling out of, but it wants to lead, right? And so already we've indicated that we're going to nominate someone to lead an American to lead the International Telecommunications Union, which is a really important body in the United Nations that manages a lot of the tech standards for things like 5G. And it's a position that's been held by a Chinese official for the past 8 years. So it's a really significant move right up front from the Biden administration. Sorry, I said I was going to be critical, but so I think. And the last part where maybe there's a little bit of difference is that you do have a willingness to cooperate on narrow areas. So, climate change, Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan. Not an interest expressed by the Biden administration in developing an overarching strategic dialogue, the kind that you had during the Obama administration and the previous Bush administrations, but just to say we are willing to cooperate, to work with China on areas where we think we can have concrete progress. We don't want to just talk for the sake of talking. Quick word on China's response to this. Chinese are extremely unhappy with the shift in leadership. They're unhappy both because the Biden administration is keeping much of what the Trump administration had been doing, and they're unhappy in particular because they see the Biden administration as trying to structure an ideological competition with China. So in the many, many Track 2 dialogues, Zoom Track 2 dialogues that I participate in with Chinese counterparts, or that I've participated in over the past year and a half or so, I will tell you the number one thing that they are concerned about is that the United States would be able to bring together an alliance of democracies. So they believe that they can manage a military, sort of some kind of military conflict in the future. They believe that they're competitive economically. But to have the world's democracies aligned against China is a different issue. And, you have to remember, 9 of the 10, world's largest economies are democracies, right? So that makes sense. China stands alone, as the one authoritarian country in that group.